So today we are very happy to have Tega Brain with us. Tega Brain is an environmental engineer who is also an artist and is based as well in Sydney as in New York, and is exploring many different types of topics such as ecology, data, automation, and she has also had a couple of installations at the Ars Electronica festival. And I think she will also do a bit of an introduction herself. But yeah, with that, before we give over the word, I would also like to maybe introduce a little bit who you're speaking to today. So today it is the students of the Founding Lab, which is this pilot semester of a new university that we're trying to start, which is all about digitalization of society and trying to tackle all these issues from a very interdisciplinary way. And also there are people from the Ars Electronica network who we send the invitation to, who might also be joining. So without further ado, I would like to give over the word to you.
Great. Can everybody hear me? Does that sound
Yes.
all right? Okay, great. Lovely. Okay, so now let me just do this awkward setup where I try to share my screen. Okay, sorry, I'm not so used to Teams, but
now we see your slides. Yes.
Great, perfect. Okay. Yeah, great. So just some tech stuff. I'm just recording this in, so I can't actually see you. So if you do have a question or you want to jump in and ask me something as we're going through, just let me know. You'll have to just unmute your audio and jump in. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely to have gotten this invitation. My name's Tega Brain. I am an artist and engineer, and I've called my talk today on working machines and environments. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, where, sorry, I don't know what happened there. Is that good? Are we back? I think so.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, where I am also teaching. I'm a professor at NYU in the Integrated Design and Media program. And I have a background in environmental engineering, and this context continues to inform my practice today. Over the past decade, I've been really interested in the politics of technologies and how technologies structure our ecology or our relationship within the environment. So I've spent the last decade making systems that ask questions about how human societies imagine, design, and build their relationships to environments. So this can be a very material matter, one that involves practices, systems, infrastructures, pipes, concrete, and now a lot of data and computation. But it's also a very conceptual matter that's shaped by ecological and infrastructural imaginaries. So I'm really interested in this interplay between the material, the infrastructures we build, and the imagined. So our sort of conceptual thinking around environment and technology. And so my art takes the form of systems, technologies, and infrastructures. And I make these things to reveal and probe imaginaries, existing imaginaries, but also as a way to try and open up new ways of thinking. So for example, you know, the way that the environment is commonly thought of as natural is a predominant imaginary that is not often questioned. Or as a system, right? We think of, since the 20th century, we think of ecology and the relationships with environments through this sort of systems framework. Or, you know, also environments are commonly thought of as resources, which leads you sort of to an extraction mindset. And so all of these imaginaries emerge from specific ways of thinking, and they all produce certain inclination and pathways for action, for design, and for management. Imaginary is a term taken from anthropology, where social imaginaries, initially theorized by political scientist Benedict Anderson, describe a set of coherent and powerful ideas held collectively by a group of people to imagine or think of their social existence. So key here are these ideas that are collectively shared, and as a result often have this kind of normative dimension that guides aspirations of how life should be lived. They thus tend to direct actions towards these ends. So ecological imaginaries are how we think about our relationality with the cohort of other life forms that make up the biosphere. And infrastructural imaginaries relate to how we imagine our systems and technologies, what we think they can do, what we think they will do, how they manage risk, and so forth. And so today I was asked to talk about the way I engage with different technologies in my work. And so I'm really, really interested in this question. So what can art practices that engage with emerging technologies do? I've been working in this way for a long time. For example, some older works where I've taken up technologies as they're being sort of more widely deployed in society include Fitbits, which is a health and activity tracking system that helps you fake and obfuscate your fitness data. And this was a project developed at the time when fitness data was becoming widespread and used in the context of like health insurance in the US. So it suddenly had this weight despite the tracking technologies being fairly dodgy. And so this is often the way I work, right? Experimenting with the technologies themselves and making these sort of public interventions that get published online and that really invite new audiences to think about how these systems are being deployed, their politics, where they break, where they function, and who stands to benefit from them. To give you another example, an older work, Bushwick Analytica. This was a project that I developed when the Cambridge Analytica scandal was sort of in the news a lot, where ads were being targeted in the context of elections, and these sort of tracking technologies were being used to try to sway public opinion in different ways. And so these were a series of workshops where I invited just young school kids. You can see the folks here are sort of 8, 9, 10 to create their own targeted advertising campaigns. So again, working with this emerging technology, putting it in the hands of folks who maybe you wouldn't expect to be working with them. And the kids came up with these gorgeous campaigns such as, no school on Mondays, and they tried to target people who were in their parents' demographic, or the bottom one is like a targeted ad campaign around a child who really wanted to get a dog, and so he tried to target his parents at their specific home address. And so again, yeah, here you see the way that I sort of like to take up different technological systems and deploy them in sort of unusual, unpredictable, unusual ways. I often call my work eccentric engineering because I'm interested not only in developing a criticality and a literacy around these technologies, but also trying to open up new ways to think about them, new imaginaries. I'm interested in art as a form of activism, and I'm interested in art as a means of addressing and breaking open opaque systems and their obscured politics for diverse audiences in diverse contexts. And so for me, eccentric engineering is a practice where I'm combining methods from systems art, social practice, critical engineering, and ontological design to question the technological status quo. It's a space for the development of experimental systems that aim to offer both critique and propose alternatives that enact a more than human politics. And so the works I'm going to show you do some of this, right? They focus on climate and environment. And they do this and aim to seed new imaginaries. So I'm interested in work that can be this way of thinking about new infrastructural and ecological imaginaries. So this sort of new ways of thinking. And that might mean, rethinking how we understand utility, productivity, progress in ways that go beyond the exclusively human. And I'll talk more about this. And then the other thing that I'm often trying to do in my work is reconfigure agency. So expand who and what gets to enact agency in systems of decision-making, go beyond this idea of just outsourcing decision-making to computation, which is sort of the mainstream approach, And so we'll also be touching again on this. And I'm also very interested in this idea that Sarah Hendren has been talking about. Sarah Hendren is a designer and author who asks similar questions in her research that looks at interdisciplinary practices that traffic between art, design, and engineering. And she talks about these kinds of technology-based practices, thinking about them through the lenses of critique and repair. So she offers 2 posts, critique and repair, with this question of how can we make work that does both? And as you're thinking about how you might shape a school or a curriculum, I think this is a really useful way to structure to think through, right? So where work that critique unmasks hidden or suppressed realities, it reveals ugly truths, it subverts or even negates mainstream or inherited or lazy narratives. And so a lot of the sort of media arts does this. But then I think we're trying to also invite this proposition or repair language, is what she calls it, where she says repair language suggests new futures. It invites possibilities and perhaps translates ideas from the past that might be reinvigorated or more accessibly understood. Or perhaps it enchants by asking, what if this new thing could come to life? What if we could think about our ecology in a new way? And so, again, in the works that I'm about to show you, I'm always kind of trying to find this balance between, as Hendren says, critique and repair. So critique of the status quo and thinking about other ways of working. And so the works that I'm going to show you today sit at the intersection of computation and climate. This is something that I've been looking at for maybe the past 5-6 years. And the way that computation is being positioned as this crucial tool in addressing the climate catastrophe. So much of the knowledge we have about the climate crisis has come through code, data, and computation. Obviously, computational models and simulations reveal the trajectory of Earth's system and inform our responses. As the climate catastrophe has progressed, proposals for climate cycle intervention and management are also becoming more commonplace. And a lot of these also rest on the assumption of planetary computational systems that can do the monitoring and management of things like carbon drawdown or more extreme environmental interventions. But I'm really interested in this idea of geoengineering or climate engineering. And, you know, when we talk about these technologies, you often see images like the ones you see on screen, right? So these big proposals to manipulate the physical environment. And what we don't see in an image like this are the people, right? We don't see the radical cultural, social, and economic transitions that we need to make to address this catastrophe. We don't see the politics of these technologies, how they impact communities. And so the work that I've made over the past few years, much of which is with a collaborator, Sam Levine, explores this idea of what an expanded notion of climate or geoengineering might be, where this goes beyond the imaginary of simply needing to reshape or re-engineer the biophysical. And it asks, how could geoengineering catalyze much needed shifts and reforms in spaces like the media, or how much we work and play, or the role of our universities and knowledge institutions in this transition? And so the works that I'll show today respond to this question. And so let's start by considering the state of the media. Crowds, gatherings, protests, wild applause online have now become clicks, likes, shares, and ad revenue. And Synthetic Messenger is a project that examines this transition, how ad-driven algorithmic media platforms today could in many ways be thought of as a geo or climate engineering technology. How has this shift to advertising-driven media shaped how the climate emergency is understood and therefore addressed and therefore acted upon? Ad-driven media platforms, recommendation engines, and the ad-driven business model of the internet have a profound way on how we understand what's happening to our environment and what we think we can do about it. So, you know, it's well discussed now. News outlets rely on revenue by selling ads that run alongside their stories. And these systems, we argue in this piece, are shaping climate coverage and our climate and ecological imaginaries. The stories we tell or don't tell, those which capture our attention, have atmospheric effects. And so this is, you know, the New York Times front page, scraped from 2020. And you can see that there's basically no mention of climate or environment. This has changed a little bit, but still the coverage of these issues is not reflecting their sort of severity and urgency. And so as a result, we started thinking about ways we might engage with these systems and came up with the project Synthetic Messenger. Synthetic Messenger is an algorithmic performance work. It examines this ad-driven media environment that we live in. And it examines this as a geoengineering technology. The work takes the form of 100 bots, each of which is animated with a quivering hand and recorded voice. So you can see a recording. It's a little bit glitchy, but it's on screen. And so the bots spend their days looking, listening for climate-related news coverage online, and then it goes to all the ads running alongside these stories and clicks on them. The work was first developed in 2020. So we first developed it as a Zoom performance where audiences were invited to join the Zoom call with the 100 bots and sort of commune with them and observe their activities.
Scroll, click,
Click.
Scroll, click.
scroll, click,
Scroll, click,
scroll, click,
Scroll. Click.
scroll,
Scroll,
click,
click.
scroll, click,
Scroll,
scroll,
click,
Scroll. Click.
scroll,
scroll,
You can see it's very pandemic influenced project here. And so more recently, I think it's enough. More recently, we've been showing this work as in an installation format. So here you can see it's installed at the Australian Centre of Contemporary Art earlier this year. And so every click on one of these ads, of course, would trigger a tiny transaction, a payment from advertiser to news outlet, and theoretically would increase the value of the article, perhaps also causing it to be automatically aggregated on more sites across the internet. As the fossil fuel industry and its supporters have known for so long, those who control the media cycle have an outsized influence on the carbon cycle. Industry-backed media manipulation strategies are really well documented and wide-ranging. They include undermining the credibility of prominent scientists and funding and circulating inaccurate research that downplays climate risks. In recent years, we've seen climate denial flip to climate doomerism and narratives that encourage inaction, falsely proclaiming that nothing can be done or that it's too late to do anything. Narrative strategies circulated by industry have also been really sophisticated. So they include framing emissions reductions as an individual rather than systemic problem. And this is an idea that hit the mainstream in 2004 when BP's PR team developed the first carbon calculator, which is what you see on screen. And so this move successfully deflected attention away from industry responsibility and towards climate as this sort of consumer individual problem, and has done so for years. This is massively influential. There's also an evolving catalogue of media manipulation strategies that specifically leverage algorithmic and economic logics of online platforms. So the use of media trolls and bots amplify misinformation. The article you see on screen was one shared during the Australian fires of the 2020 summer. And most recently, a similar thing happened during the Canadian wildfires last year, where bots and trolls spread this idea that the fires are just driven by arsonists and do not have anything to do with climate change, right? So these false claims. We've also got to think about who owns these platforms. So the impact of people like Rupert Murdoch and their sort of monopoly on a lot of media platforms has amplified problems like this. And while the recent anxieties about bots and trolls and automated activity, particularly in the context of electoral politics, are perhaps disproportionate to their actual impact, the use of these technologies to spread and amplify climate information is a genuine challenge in the media ecosystem that remains sympathetic to climate deniers. And so when I show this work, I often get the question, did the bots work? How much money did you raise for different news outlets? Like, how is this system working? How can we quantify it? And it's a really hard question to answer. I mean, digital ad systems are pretty opaque, and it's impossible for us to audit the revenue created by this work because we're obviously don't have access to like New York Times data or the data of the different news outlets. But this is part of the problem with these media systems. As author Tim Huang observes in his book Subprime Attention Crisis, consumer behavior is exposed in fine detail, but overall market behavior stays opaque. The real price of ads is obscured. Algorithmic trading means it's impossible to know where ads even end up, and buyers are beholden to the data produced by a few large platforms who then stand to benefit from these transactions. But what we do know about this work is that in 2 weeks, it visited over 2 million sites and clicked on over 6 million ads. And so this data is shown online on the dashboard on the website when the system is running. And you can see it sort of accumulates clicks and page views and so forth. So we do try to present as much as the data as we can about each bot, but there are definite limitations there. Okay, and so I'm going to now talk about another work, Perfect Sleep, that is another expanded geoengineering initiative. And this project, also made with Sam Levine, addresses sleep and rest and work schedules as a potential site for intervention, for climate intervention. So Perfect Sleep investigates sleep and dreaming as a climate engineering technology. And in this work, we invite people to experiment with their own sleep cycles and to explore how a lack of sleep and climate change are both products of the same extractivist capitalist system where regeneration, rest, and natural limits go unvalued. So the work is realized in 2 parts, as an installation and as a smartphone alarm clock app. So the app is available in the Apple App Store. I invite you to go download it and experiment with it. And it's called the Perfect Sleep app, so if you search for that. And it's an app that allows users to adjust their sleep schedule. So basically it's like an alarm clock app, but gradually over time, it increases sleep time. So it will set your alarm later and later over the course of 3 years until you achieve a state of total sleep or perfect sleep, which we define as 24 hours of rest. As your sleep time increases, the app suggests an appropriate schedule. So it also divides up your remaining time into leisure and work. We acknowledge that, of course, being able to work less is a privilege many people don't have. As a result, we originally wanted to make the app $10,000 in the App Store so that only the right people would use it and download it. Right people meaning those most responsible for the crisis we're in. But unfortunately, our curators wouldn't let us do this, so it's currently listed in the App Store as free. But yeah, maybe we should release an exclusive version. So here's a potential schedule. So as you can see, by day 613, you are sleeping for 16 hours, 42 minutes. You're enjoying 7 hours and 18 minutes of leisure, and you're working for 0 hours and 0 minutes. And by day 1051, you have achieved total sleep. The app also tracks your estimated economic output and carbon emissions as your sleep time increases and your work time decreases. So we produced, to make these predictions, we made an extremely sophisticated climate model drawing on research that correlates average sleep time and GDP, and then GDP and carbon emissions. So for example, here are some estimations of what happens to GDP and CO2 relative to sleep time, where sleep is on the x-axis. The App Store, of course, is already filled with sleep and resting apps. Silicon Valley has a deep interest in rest, but of course its interest comes out of this idea of increasing productivity rather than decreasing it. So on these graphs, you'll notice that as sleep initially increases, so as we move right across the graphs, productivity gets increased. And that's because in the studies that we used, the population is generally a little bit underslept. So if we increase our sleep time by a little bit, productivity actually goes up initially. And so then after this unfortunate blip, things start to go in the direction we want to see them go. So in addition to this app, the project is also realized as an installation made with these custom daybeds, where we took inspiration from Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain. And these are positioned in the gallery. We also commissioned a series of texts, which are dream incubation texts from some of our favorite authors, Simone Brown, Joanna Hedbar, Holly Jean Buck, and Sophie Lewis. And these texts invite sleepers to dedicate their dream space to envisaging a world beyond our own. And so we worked with composer Luisa Pereira to set these texts to dreamscapes. So they're these beautiful kind of dreamy sleep transitions, if you like. And so you can listen to these in the daybeds. They're also available in the app to help you get to sleep. Okay. So synthetic messenger reveals and therefore critiques how the outsourcing of agency to algorithmic media platforms and to opaque data-driven systems. Perfect Sleep also does a similar thing, right? Where it's a work that's trying to leverage the agency we attribute to our apps, to our phones, to try to arrive at a healthier rest schedule. So in many ways, these two works continue to imagine a sort of technological regime where we're outsourcing agency and decision-making to computation and data-driven systems. And through these works, I started thinking about ways of sort of configuring systems differently. If technological regimes could sort of attribute agency in new ways, perhaps not outsourcing decision-making completely to computation, what would it look like to outsource decision-making to environments or to naturally occurring systems? Could automation happen in a different way that wasn't so computationally centered? And so Solar Protocol is a work that I began in late 2020, early 2021, that looks at these questions of how agency is distributed and redistributed by computation. It's a large community project that is a collaboration with Alex Nathanson, Benedetta Piantella, and a whole number of volunteers around the world. And we began with research into the enormous resources required by the ever-growing cloud and our digital technologies. Some studies estimate that the internet and computational technologies, those things that we call the cloud, produce as much CO2 as the aviation industry. This was obviously particularly accelerated during the 2020, 2021 years of the pandemic, where so much of our activity flipped online. And, you know, over the years since, recent droughts throughout Europe and the world have also revealed how much water and other kinds of material resources, data centers and the digital demand. And so this is also being exacerbated by the energy intensive of AI technologies, which, you know, particularly in the last year have really exploded. And so we began experimenting with small scale solar power computers and designed a solar powered web server that could serve a website. However, given it's solar powered, operating alone, particularly in a New York winter like now, a solar server would often run out of energy. We were super inspired by Low-Tech's work in this space, where they have published their entire magazine archives on a solar server. But you can see their byline is like, this is a solar-powered website, which means it sometimes goes offline. And so we were interested in what would it look like, instead of having one standalone solar server, to think about could solar servers be networked, and could we rely on sort of social relations to give more uptime and more reliability to these technologies. And so we began to work with people around the world to host a network of these. We wanted to set up servers in different time zones and different latitudes and different weather systems. And so we have distributed a lot of them that then collectively serve a web platform at solarprotocol.net. And then the next step was writing custom networking software so that each server checks in with the network, each server checks in with whatever other servers are online, and asks, how much sunlight are you receiving? And whichever server is in the most sunlight at the time becomes the server that actively serves the web platform. So across the day, across a 24-hour period, but also across a 12-month period, this changes, right? The sunniest server is obviously contingent on climate, season, position, weather, local conditions. And so again, another visualization of some of the locations of the servers, and so the website's coming from these different places. So this routing behavior means that Solar Protocol is routing network traffic according to the availability of solar energy in the environment. This also means that computational work is distributed to wherever there is the most energy in the network. So this is a graph you can see of solar energy data, and the green shows whichever is the active server of the time, or the point of entry, we were calling it for a while. And so you can see it jumps around over this period of time, matching whichever server is getting sunlight. And so here we have a system where the network's operations are not automated by, say, a machine learning system. They're not automated by a statistical model. Rather, they're automated by the environment itself. The sun and the environment are enlisted to automate decisions about where the site is served from, where the computational work in the system is done. We also made an API so that you can access energy data from any server in the network. And so this data configured another way is shown here, where every ring is a different server. The yellow is the sunlight data, and the active server is the colored line you see. And so just to return to some of those questions I was asking at the beginning, artists taking up technology, experimenting with them in different ways, returning to that question of art as a means of critique and proposition and repair. So this work moves from just a critique of the status quo, which consists of large-scale computation and current imaginaries for AI, and it moves towards thinking about another way of designing and thinking about intelligence. Rather than creating machines to automate environments, what would the inverse look like? What would machines look like that are automated by their environments? What if we outsource that agency to make decisions to climate conditions, to environmental conditions? And so when making this work, I was also really thinking about planetary limits as protocols, right? So the local availability of energy could be read as a kind of logic or protocol. And this very much resonates with the work of Robin Wall-Kimmerer and the idea of the honorable harvest. So in a lot of indigenous cosmologies, this idea of environmental logics is read as sort of rule systems or governing systems of governance that sort of create a more horizontal, less hierarchical relationship between humans and environments. And so how might we design in ways that are more of a collaboration with environmental intelligences? How might we design platforms that rethink what intelligence is, and that operate within planetary boundaries. So of course, this network goes down a lot at the moment. A lot of our servers are offline, and it's the Northern Hemisphere winter. So, you know, there is a sort of compromise that exists in this work as well. As a result, we also, like the low-tech folks, did a lot of work to try to reduce the energy demands of the website, where the assets have been reduced in size. The graphics and visuals are generated server-side with static site generators rather than client-side, because we wanted to know that they were generated with renewable energies rather than fossil energies, which is probably powering a lot of our browsers still. And so the website is minimal. And of course, you know, this sort of redesigning the infrastructural level has the result of rethinking the way that what design criteria you use, what the graphics look like, and sort of, yeah, create a new set of criteria for design and aesthetics, which I think is fascinating. But these design challenges weren't the hardest thing about this project. What the hardest thing about this project actually was opening up port 80. So if you want to serve a website from your house or from your home, you need to open up port 80. And actually, this is really, really hard thing to do. So particularly in institutional contexts like universities or galleries, you're dealing with an IT department, and it's been really, really difficult. Also, the way that ISPs work and the way that networks are controlled happens really differently in different contexts around the world, which is something we've learned. And so in our experience, the web isn't anywhere near as open or decentralized as we might assume it to be. It also turns out that community networking is very, very messy. And so I think, again, as I've mentioned, it's really interesting in that the stronger the social network across our stewards and the people participating in this project, the more uptime we have. And so the work is very much contingent on people's relationships, their living situations. We have had stewards break up with girlfriends or boyfriends, have to move house, the server is put into a cupboard for 6 months. So the social is so integrated with the technological in this work. And that's why that a lot of the servers are up and down at different times of the year and at different points in the project. But we have a working prototype of this, and in many ways it's a solar-powered, artist-run community cloud. Earlier this year, we launched our first group exhibition on the platform, and we invited and commissioned a lot of work from writers and artists that we admire, who were invited to work with the solar power data, the solar protocol data. And so I invite you to take a look at some of these works. Yeah, I mean, there's some lovely pieces in there. For example, Alison Parrish has made a sort of solar powered language generator. Everest Pipkin made a really lightweight game that uses some of the solar data, as did Kristen Lucas and Joe Mackay, who produced 3D animations in response to the data coming from each server. Okay, so I think I have about 5 to 10 more minutes. So I am going to just share some more recent work that I've been doing over the past year that takes a turn towards more looking at climate activism and what we can do in cultural spaces and research institutions at a time of climate catastrophe. So this latest sort of series of pieces really started with a piece of work that looked at the way that academic timelines in many ways exceed the pace and urgency of the disastrous climate situation we are in. If you think about how long it takes to get degrees, PhDs, it can take decades of work, and yet we have to act on this crisis immediately right now. We don't have decades. And so therefore, what role should our institutions take in in this transition and in the work we have to do. And so a lot of this, my more recent work, looks at this question. And it began because we got a climate grant to make some art from NYU. And I was working with Sam Levine still at the time, and we really were thinking about what would be the most effective thing we could do with this money, right? And so we really got interested in figuring out ways to just give it basically to climate activists and try to shine a light on the really important work that they're doing. Folks like this woman who you see on screen, who was part of an action in Australia that shut down one of the largest coal ports for over a week. Amazing stuff. And so we formed a limited liability company called Redistribute LLC in order to redistribute the money from my university, NYU, to these people who are actually doing the work on the ground. Navigating university admin is not easy. And so we used this entity to then just do a series of paid interviews with former political prisoners who have been incarcerated for their climate activism. So this is an ongoing project to celebrate and financially support those who have experienced severe governmental punishment, violence, and retaliation for their direct action. The archive currently includes interviews from Max Kermey, who's an Australian who got 6 months for shutting down a port in Australia as part of the action you just saw on the previous slide, with a group called Blockade Australia. We interviewed Red Fawn Fallis, who got 4 years for participating in the Standing Rock actions. Daniel McGowan, who did 7 years for his participation in the Earth Liberation Front a couple of decades ago, so giving a bit more of the historical perspective on activism. Also an anonymous activist named Rose, who basically started Extinction Rebellion in Sudan and faced devastating consequences for doing this, and has since been on the run and seeking refugee status ever since. So also very interesting and revealing how climate activism is being treated in different parts of the world, but being, cracked down on by states everywhere. And so this is a quote that Max Kermey shared with us from Blockade Australia. You hear a lot of people talk about the system's broken, the system's malfunctioning, we need to fix the system, but it's not actually broken. It's performing exactly the way it was set up. And so as the crisis deepens, we're seeing governments around the world use every means at their disposal to crack down on protest and activism. However, in exercising their power, they simultaneously reveal their own fragility. The extreme legal and police response to climate resistance is a tacit acknowledgement of the incredible potential opened up by those attempting to enact a livable future. So there's this interesting kind of contradiction there. And so we're increasingly thinking about sabotage and the use of strategies of sabotage to call attention and question what we mean by these words: productivity, efficiency, successful operation of a system. In synthetic messenger, we employ a form of digital sabotage, where sabotage is perhaps best defined by Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who is a Labour leader and author, and she defines it as the withdrawal of efficiency. So the aim of affecting the profits of a boss. And the work of climate activists take this to the climate crisis. And this has really gotten us interested in the benefits of sabotage and activism, and potentially the quantification of these actions as well. And so what I'm working on with Sam at the moment is a project called Offset, where we began thinking about whether we could reward sabotage and systematize the redistribution of funds to those doing significant work blocking fossil infrastructure through the logic of emerging carbon markets. So carbon markets obviously being an attempt to scale the management of the carbon cycle. Carbon markets sell offsets, which represent actions that are intended to compensate for carbon emissions to the atmosphere. So, traditionally something like planting a forest or deciding not to chop it down for 20 years are converted to offsets and then are bought and sold by companies or nation states or individuals to try to compensate for carbon emissions. Carbon offsets apply the logic of capitalism to atmospheric interactions. This logic assumes that all activities on Earth can be quantified, abstracted, and therefore exchanged. And offsets produce the capacity to kind of outsource one's consumption at the scale of the individual or the corporation or the nation state to someone else, somewhere else, or even to generations of the future. And therefore, they're very much this attempt to maintain and entrench the status quo rather than the root causes of the climate catastrophe. But does putting a price on carbon so that it can be traded, so that it can be fungible, actually result in sequestration and drawdown? Well, there's not a lot of evidence of this as emissions continue to rise. And I love the work of Dr. Sarah Bracking, who's at King's College in London. And she studies climate finance and the role of sort of money in the climate conversation. And this is a quote from her. Promises of money from global institutions and governments have financialized people's hopes and expectations of government action to adapt to climate change and slow the emission of greenhouse gases. Because of the cultural power of money in our understanding of the world, climate finance has had the particular job of signifying action while delivering very little. So she's very interested in this idea of money and finance as spectacle. And we see this happening in the offset space, where it gives the appearance of action while actually achieving very little material change. The process of converting actions into carbon credits is also one of data collection, quantification, and calculation. Geographer Holly Jean Buck writes a lot on how net zero is a massive computational challenge. So in addition to the cultural power of money, which offsets rely on, they also rely on this dream or this imaginary of expanded computing and computability. And they rely on these imaginaries commingling. For example, I talked about forests. This is a pretty simple example of a carbon offset, generation of a carbon offset, but there are many other much more elaborate methodologies for calculating credits. And so basically, as in the first stage of this project, we've been taking existing industry methods and applying them to instances of industrial sabotage to calculate their carbon benefits. Why aren't direct actions and these really effective moves to sort of shut down fossil infrastructure included in these carbon markets? So we published a white paper that we're working on submitting to some carbon registries that's called Industrial Sabotage as Temporary Carbon Storage. And temporary carbon storage is a forestry method that generates carbon credits from delaying actions like chopping down a forest or creating emissions. And in many ways, this is similar to shutting down a coal port for 10 days or blocking a pipeline for a number of months. You're temporarily storing those fossil fuels. And so in many ways, this work also does what I talked about at the outset. It's sort of creating an opportunity to think about what is happening in this carbon market space and creating a way to engage with these logics and these approaches that are sort of buried in PDFs. They're super dry. They're really, you talk about carbon accounting and it's not really the most exciting conversation you could have, right? So often in my work, and particularly my collaborative work with Sam, we try to create, opportunities to bring audiences and new people into these spaces where there's, this is super significant in how the climate catastrophe is being dealt with. So you can see the project sort of unfold online at offset.labor.io. And this is our platform at the moment. And so we're in the process of developing more methodologies for generating carbon credits and so forth. And with our goal that we will be hoping to sell these eventually. And so just to wrap up, I think I'm at time. But both Solar Protocol and Offset attempt to critique at existing technological trajectories. But they also suggest an alternative. They propose or offer another way to think and another way to act in these spaces. Solar Protocol attends to the energy impacts of our internet technologies and at the same time builds an alternative. And in Offset, we show actions that are left out of carbon markets, and we try to use some humor to suggest a way for them to be brought in and rewarded and quantified. These are works that ask how art practices can be active in the world and not just sit at that level of representation or exploration, but what can we actually do? What systems can we put in place that create change or opportunities for change? Author James Bridle calls this kind of systems-based art work that does the work. And so I'm really interested in this sort of active role that creative practice can take. Because I think we're in desperate need of art practices that reveal where we have agency. You know, a big part of the climate catastrophe is this feeling that we can't do anything. And so how do we create work that gives hints and methods for where we can leverage more agency, where we can find more of it? I think this is really important at this time to address, these issues of how technology and ecology are so intermingled. Thank you so much. I think I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much.